Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. It's May 18th, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're talking about agroecology, which applies ecological principles to agricultural systems and is considered an important strategy for both mitigating and adapting to global climate change. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said in the third and final section of its latest review of climate science, released last month, that the threats posed by climate change are worse than ever, and that while the window for taking action to avert the worst impacts of global warming may still be open, it won't be for much longer. In a subsequent special report on climate change and land, addressing greenhouse gas changes in ecosystems, land use, and sustainable land management, the IPCC urged a set of steps for policymakers to adopt, including agroecology and its tree-centric cousin, agroforestry. In response, Mongabay is publishing a series of special features by best-selling author Anna Lepay about the power and promise of agroecology. For the latest installment in the series, Lepay spoke with numerous experts about the growing agroecological movement, including University of California, Santa Cruz professor Maywa Montenegro, who joins us on the show today to discuss agroecology as a science, practice, and movement. We also speak today with Dr. Vandana Shiva, a Right Livelihood Award winner and defender of food sovereignty, who's a well-known proponent of agroecology. Her brand new book, Agroecology and Regenerative Agriculture, Sustainable Solutions for Hunger, Poverty, and Climate Change, synthesizes decades of agroecology research and implementation. Dr. Shiva tells us how agroecology is an effective solution not just to climate change, but also to a host of other ecological crises we're facing, such as water scarcity, land degradation, and biodiversity loss.
Ecology in agriculture means understanding how the soil, the plants, the biodiversity are interconnected, how centuries of good farming informs agroecological practices today.
Dr. Maywa Montenegro is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She was quoted in an article author Anna Lepay wrote for Mongabay called From Traditional Practice to Top Climate Solution, Agroecology Gets Growing Attention, which was published last month. We'll link to the article in the show notes in case you want to check it out, but one thing you'll find there is that Montenegro told Lepay that the field of agroecology includes the academy, but very importantly is not limited to it. Agroecology is a science, practice, and a movement. I asked her to expand on that point for us.
For me, agroecology is a science, practice, and social movement. Those things are mutually entwined. I really appreciate the definition that we use here at Santa Cruz, where we consider agroecology as the integrative study of the entire food system. It's rooted in indigenous and traditional knowledge. It has expanded over the decades to cross-pollinate with Western ecological science. It encompasses ecological, economic, and social dimensions, and we really understand and encourage students to understand that agroecology in integrating science and research is also a paradigm for social change. So they start to move beyond kind of observations and studies of practices and systems design to thinking more expansively about politically engaged transformation of the food system. And that for me is really a powerful paradigm shift, I think, that we are trying to promote not just here at UC Santa Cruz, but across the North American continent, where arguably agroecology has room to scale out, a term that we prefer over scaling up so that we're not reproducing the industrial food system. But we have a lot to learn from indigenous and Latinx and Black farm communities, both in the States and around the world, who are already doing this kind of work.
For agroecology to really grow around the globe, people need to be trained in the techniques and practices, which go way beyond just organic farming, of course. Your own university has had an agroecology program for a long time and recently launched a new agroecology major. Who are the students that you've seen taking these classes and majoring in agroecology, and what do they go on to do with their training?
So I am new to the university. I started only a year ago. I want to give credit to a wide variety of faculty and staff that have have been working on the agroecology major for decades, and it has finally come to fruition. But it really begins with the land, and we have the Chadwick Garden here since the late 1960s. That was a place for students to gather and get their hands on the soil and work with plants. In the early 1970s, that was expanded to a 30-acre farm that became the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, or a CASFAS, became world renowned as an apprenticeship program and a site for agroecology study here on the college campus. That has recently been renamed as the Center for Agroecology, and it provides just a huge variety of opportunities for students in terms of both experiential learning, which they can get through courses that have farm-based components, internships that I've been really fortunate to have students work with me on internships both at the Chadwick Garden and the student farm, research, which they can do during the year and also over the summer, more in-depth, and also production. So students are there growing crops that actually make it out into CSAs and into food pantries and into a variety of spaces that are particularly justice oriented, so going into the food baskets of folks who need it most. So I say that really having a farm here is something that is hard to overstate the significance of what it means to really work materially with the soil for students that may not have had exposure to that through only literature or texts. I've been working with a few students through the internships, and during COVID, it has really been a refuge for the students. They keep journals, and I've seen people write to me that it's their favorite part of the day. They go and they spend time weeding, digging through the soil. Like, I had one student who was an artist, and they sketched all of the plants that they were getting to know and familiarize themselves with. So their notebook was actually like an artist's sketchbook of the berries and the different crops that they were asked to help tend, and that served for them as their internship report. Another student was really interested in labor practices, and so wrote their internship report on all of the different kinds of labor that go into managing the farm, from weeding to boxing up all of the produce to shipping it out. And I seldom have to teach the students much about the practices. They bring so much knowledge into this space, and definitely they are learning through their coursework and through the training that they get with the advisors on the farm. But it is incredible to see what students, especially when they are children of farm workers in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have a lot of students whose heritage is from farming families and the diaspora, especially from Central America and Mexico, and they come here and they have this knowledge. I don't have to tell them what a cob of corn looks like or what tres hermanas, what that means for their culture and community. So it's been a really interesting process for me to take part in.
Well, I know that there are now dozens of agroecology schools and programs around the world, and you noted in that Mongabay article by Anna Lepay that the Sustainable Agriculture Education Association keeps a growing list of degree-granting programs in agroecology, as well as applied student farm programs where students learn experientially, which you were just talking about. How widespread of an educational movement would you say this really is? And what excites you about this growing interest in agroecology?
Right. Yes, the SAEA website has a nice long list for students who are seeking programs at the master's and bachelor's and even PhD levels in agroecology training. We've been trying to keep those up and keep the links live. There are a growing number of schools with accredited programs and degree granting majors in agroecology, which I think is really exciting because it's putting a finer point on a fairly vague term of sustainable agriculture. Agroecology, as we defined a short while ago, is much more than just practices of sustainable agriculture. It resists the orthodoxies of industrial agriculture based on extractivism and control over life and the commodification of life and land, and it really takes a critical look at issues of the structural and social forces that are based on old and ongoing processes of colonialism and racial capitalism. And the agroecology students may not come into it with that sharp of a problem analysis, but they often get there. And that's what's really exciting is I think that these programs across the US are starting to understand that we only go so far when we limit ourselves to only looking at ecological or management practices, when we really need to integrate our understanding of the ecology to also reflect social processes. I don't mean to say that the social is somehow better than the ecological, not at all. In fact, from an indigenous point of view, society and people are nature. So all of us Westerners have it upside down. And I'm saying us Westerners, I am half Peruvian indigenous. And so I always have these wonderful long-ranging conversations with my father, who's Quechua, and he's like, but people are natural. Why do you keep separating them, right? And so I think understanding ourselves as part of an ecosystem and as human beings living in relation to one another and the planet, that is the kind of paradigm shift I think we are seeing in different ways. All of these programs on the SAEA website, they're rooted in different places, places with different institutional contexts, different histories. Land-grant universities have very different relationships maybe than some of the private schools, but I'm excited because I see that there is an institutionalization of agroecology. There are risks to institutionalization. It can get watered down and co-opted and become meaningless, but I think it also gathers and gains legitimacy through that process when people are paying attention. They aren't saying that it is some like woo-woo thing that isn't based in science. It is. It has an established complex ecosystem science behind it. It has a powerful social movement. It has practices that are evidence-based. And it's on that basis that we start to really transform the food system.
You co-authored a paper that came out in November 2019 titled Transitioning to Sustainable Agriculture Requires Growing and Sustaining an Ecologically Skilled Workforce. You and your co-authors wrote that we have a brief window to decarbonize our food systems, enhance their delivery of ecosystem services, and buffer farmers and farming from the impacts of climate change. Has there been much progress in terms of policy or science or otherwise in the 2.5 years since that was published that would allow us to capitalize on that brief window?
We were writing that paper in the context of a lot of conversations around the Green New Deal, right? And so Ocasio-Cortez and Markey.
That's U.S. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and U.S. Senator Ed Markey
had come up with a plan, a very ambitious plan to decarbonize the U.S. economy and across sectors from energy to agriculture to transportation. A lot of groups, civil society groups, philanthropic groups, scientific organizations, were also a bit concerned that there wasn't a lot of meat on the bones of what the agricultural part would look like. And so after that proposal came out, there was a tremendous amount of activity of people trying to sketch a proposal for transitioning agriculture and food systems to sort of meet the demands of a Green New Deal. And it was sort of in that time period that we were coming together and thinking about, well, what policies exist that could be better leveraged, and what new things could we see on the horizon? And so there are a couple of things that I would say, and one is about the workforce. The United States currently has less than 2% of its population farming, and so if we are serious about an agroecological transition, we really need to think about getting more people back onto the land and providing the institutional and structural supports and the possibilities to make that happen. And that goes into a much longer history of why people aren't on the land anyway: indigenous land possession, Black land loss and dispossession. And so we can return to questions about making reparations possible and doable. We didn't actually go into a lot of that in the paper. That is where I say the conversation has advanced, is actually accountability for the land that was stolen and that must be returned. Those are going to be the agroecologists of the future. In many cases, they could possibly use some additional training, but they also have a lot of in-depth knowledge that agroecology scientists continue to learn from. And then the other piece is a little bit more technical, complicated, and I would say is at the vanguard of where agroecology is both really exciting to some people, but it is facing some threats of being watered down in some ways, as there's an interest in viewing the kinds of practices that agroecology promotes, particularly with respect to the soils, as an easy fix to the climate crisis. And so, for example, some proposals in the wake of the Green New Deal were to really kind of focus all our attention on carbon sequestration and on better soil health practices that could lock more and more carbon, zero carbon initiatives, and put as much carbon into the soil as possible. And that sometimes goes under the umbrella of regenerative agriculture. So we've started to see some really interesting debates between what frequently is known as RA, or regenerative agriculture, and agroecology. And I say that these are debates, and why it's complicated is that some regenerative ag, and I might call them deep regenerative ag, is exactly the same as agroecology, but there is another lineage of it that is very much in the pocket of big agribusiness and is mostly interested in regenerative ag as a business opportunity and sees carbon markets as a way to capitalize. I think you used the term capitalize, to capitalize on carbon markets as a new investment. And that is not the vision and proposal of agroecology as a political project or as a meaningful way to destabilize the social order and the power that entrenches the current industrial system. That is where it gets complicated.
In that paper, you also write that the greatest sustainability challenge for agriculture may well be that of replacing non-renewable resources with ecologically skilled people. We've been talking about these educational programs that are spreading around the world. Do you think we're starting to crank out this ecologically skilled workforce at the level that's needed?
I would say that we are on the path. We have some understanding of what's needed. There are a lot of obstacles to its manifestation. The reason that I always like to go beyond the borders of the United States, even though this paper was focused on what's happening here, is that agroecology really is a transnational project. So those ecologically skilled people, they already exist. The majority, 80, upwards of 90% of food in the world is produced by smallholder farmers, many of them relying on practices that, if we were to go to the textbooks, we might define as agroecological, even if they don't necessarily use those words. And the international movement, La Via Campesina, which represents somewhere between 250 and 300 million peasant farmers, pastoralists, indigenous communities, landless workers, and fisher peoples, they are really at the vanguard of advancing agroecology and food sovereignty. They see agroecology and an ecologically based way of producing food as a necessary instrument, a necessary pathway towards food sovereignty. And so for me, it's very exciting and encouraging that La Via Campesina has taken up agroecology. And this was codified in a 2015 document, but they've been thinking explicitly through the lens of agroecology since the early 2000s. And I see that is where I gain a lot of encouragement. I think students, when they hear about the origins of La Via Campesina, they can see their part in a broader transformative shift. That is where we are able to really encourage students to see themselves as active agents in changing a food system that sometimes feels like they feel paralyzed because the problems are so tremendous. And when they learn about the history, they can sometimes feel immobilized and quite lost as to how they can exercise their power other than by using their wallet, other than by buying, food at an organic grocery store. But when they start to hear about movements both internationally and locally that are thinking through the lens of food sovereignty, that is when I begin to see more optimism in the way that they think about their role as agents in making food systems change.
You had another quote in that Mongabay article where you said that there is palpable excitement about the resurgent interest in agroecology. And I would love it if you could say something about why agroecology is so important right now and why there should be excitement about growing interest in it.
I think in some ways there's not really another choice. We are working with a food system that is fundamentally broken for the majority of people. For meatpacking workers during the COVID crisis, they were, ruthlessly thrown into those meatpacking plants and essentially sentenced to lose their lives due to exposure to the virus. To the grocery store workers who didn't have enough personal protective equipment, to farm workers, including in the Salinas Valley, who were told, socially distance and mask up, and yet they have housing that is extremely cramped. They are transported to the fields on crowded buses. They were basically treated like cheap and replaceable labor. The food system, in the words of Eric Holt Jimenez, is not actually broken. However, it is working very well for some people, and those groups, those actors, continue to exert an extraordinary amount of influence and power to keep the system that we have now, one that is dominated by corporate power and influence. But we know agroecologists, who are scientists, practitioners, farmers, and the movements that include us both, that there is another way. And so that's very exciting to me as a researcher, as someone who identifies as a scholar activist, because we know that there's a way out. We can learn from one another. We can extend the knowledge. We can exercise a lot of what I call epistemic humility, knowledge about what we know and we don't know, to learn from people who are already, based on their indigenous and land-based knowledge, have sustained agroecology as a meaningful practice for thousands of years, including in my homeland in Peru. And so learning to listen and learning to unlearn the ways that we have been trained are the necessary and unquestioned pathways of feeding the world, of commodifying food, of treating land as something that is private property. All of those things can be unlearned. And that is what, for me, agroecology provides. That is so exciting, and I think is what is a gift that I am excited to share with my students, my colleagues, my coworkers, and kindred scholar activists.
Dr. Vandana Shiva originally trained as a physicist, but she has spent the last 4 decades examining how industrial agriculture is devastating our planet and researching how we can grow our food more sustainably. She started a research foundation in 1982 and then 2 years later founded Navdanya, which she describes as a movement in defense of biodiversity and small farmers. I asked her to tell us how she defines agroecology and how it can help address some of the ecological crises we're facing, from land degradation and water scarcity to climate change and biodiversity loss.
Agroecology is just a capsule word for ecological agriculture. Ecological agriculture is a combination of 2 words. Ecological, that means the science of ecology, the laws of relationship of how nature works, and agriculture, with its original meaning, is care for the land. So ecology in agriculture means understanding how the soil, the plants, the biodiversity are interconnected, how centuries of good farming informs agroecological practices today. For example, what's called organic farming was learned by the British imperial botanist, Sir Albert Howard, when he arrived and found that there was nothing he could do to improve Indian agriculture. And he wrote the book called The Agricultural Testament. That's an agroecological testament. What are the multiple problems that we face today, and how are they linked to industrial agriculture, which is the denial of ecology and not a caring for the land, but a carelessness of war against the land? Number 1, species extinction. The whole design of industrial agriculture is for chemicals. The companies that designed it were chemical companies. Chemicals need monocultures. Monocultures mean displacement of biodiversity. It also means huge amounts of fossil fuel use directly for the chemicals, but also for the mechanization. And as Emery Lovins has said, in fact, industrialism is based on energy slaves. That is where the greenhouse gases are coming from. Carbon dioxide, but nitrous oxide, which comes from synthetic fertilizer use. And methane, which doesn't come from cows, but it comes from industrial farming, a bad diet, and concentration camps for cows. So biodiversity loss, climate change, hunger. because it's a system designed for the hunger of profits. It is not a system designed to feed people. Look at the amount of corn and soya being grown in America. Look at the amount of soya that's devastating the Amazon. None of it is feeding people. About 80% is going for biofuel and animal feed. It's raw material. It is not food. So the hunger epidemic, a structural hunger epidemic, is linked to this. But I would even add, I did an essay on COVID and the new emergent infectious diseases. 300 new diseases have come because of the invasion of agribusiness into forests. And then the product of industrialism is not food anymore. I have called it anti-food, which is why we have chronic diseases. Food nourishes us. Food makes us. Food is our body. Food is our blood. But when we eat toxics, what we get is the chronic diseases. And that is, in my view, the biggest economic burden on the world today. So touch any problem the world faces. Industrial agriculture is at its roots, and ecological agriculture is the solution because it heals the broken cycles.
So your new book is called Agroecology and Regenerative Agriculture. Are those the same thing, or what's the difference between them?
Ecological agriculture is agriculture according to the laws of ecology. The laws of ecology are two foundational principles. The first principle is diversity. Nature does not work on the basis of monocultures and uniformity. The second law of nature is nature recycles. This is called the law of return. Nature and ecological agriculture is not based on extractivism. You just don't keep taking nutrients from the soil. You just don't keep taking genes from the seeds. You constantly give back. So all the different words that practice these two principles are ecological agriculture. You could call it agroecology, you could call it permaculture, you could call it organic farming, you could call it regenerative agriculture, you could call it biodynamic agriculture, you could call it natural farming because it works according to the laws of nature. These words actually are more associated with founders of particular groups of people who practice ecological agriculture in a certain way. The principles are the umbrella that connects it all.
In the book, you actually talk about three huge crises threatening our food system. There's the ecological crises that we were just talking about, but then also public health and farmers' livelihoods. And you write that the most significant contribution to all three of these crises comes from a fossil fuel intensive, chemical intensive, and capital intensive system. Could you tell us about the causes of these three crises and how they're all intertwined?
I have started to work on agriculture since 1984, which is not just the name of Orwell's novel, the book called 1984. It is the year when Punjab, the land where the Green Revolution, which is the name of chemical agriculture, was first introduced in the world, 1965-66, by the Rockefeller Foundation, the World Bank, and in 20 years, it had devastated the most prosperous part of India. And that's where I had done my MSc honors in particle physics. So I knew the land before the destruction. And I watched how 30,000 people were killed in the violence. And I asked myself, how could the Green Revolution get a Nobel Peace Prize when on the ground there is war? And I wrote a book then called The Violence of the Green Revolution for the United Nations University, for whom I was doing a program. That same year, on the 2nd of December, a pesticide plant leaked in the city of Bhopal, killed thousands. And people are still dying because of that 84 disaster. So between the violence in Punjab and what happened in Bhopal, I started to ask myself, where did this kind of farming that kills so many people come from? And then I traced it back to Hitler's labs, to the poison cartel, to IG Farben, Monsanto, Standard Oil, all of that got unraveled. What are the bases of the three big problems in that system? Because after the war machinery could have folded up and gone home. But instead of going home, they said, let us expand this war to agriculture. Rachel Carson has written about this in Silent Spring. Albert Howard has written about this in his book, Agricultural Testament, that the war industry didn't stop the war and brought it to agriculture. That's why the birds were dying. That is why the soils were dying. So the two big problems of the earth, the biodiversity extinction and climate change, is totally related to this model of chemical intensive, fossil fuel intensive agriculture. You can literally look at all the literature, scientific literature that connects it. Just today, there's a new report on how insects are disappearing. Well, if you spray insecticides everywhere and pesticides everywhere, insects will disappear. And insects are not pests. Insects are part of the web of life. The same system also destroys our health because it isn't just attacking the food on the farm. That food on the farm is eaten by us, and it is now attacking our gut microbiome. And all the new medical research is showing that all disease begins with the damage to the gut microbiome, which is 100 trillion organisms. Soil organisms are being destroyed, and research is now showing, and our research in the book included, is showing how regenerative agriculture, organic farming, agroecology actually increases the soil health, and through the soil health, the plant health, and through the plant health, human health. We understand this is a continuum. But when you bring poisons into agriculture, you start a trigger of disease. And part of what surprises me is that most people don't see that the same companies that brought the poisons are also big pharma. So they will give you Roundup-induced cancer and then have the patented cancer drug. For them, it's a perpetual motion profit machine. In terms of farmers' livelihoods, it's a system which, instead of allowing farmers to work with their soil, to work with organic matter, to work with regeneration and biodiversity, which is all shown in our book in deep practice with details of how there are 20 ways to regenerate the soil, how there are 120 friendly insects on the Navdanya farm. We have to work with biodiversity. We have to make peace with biodiversity instead of the war. And the war means farmers must buy costly inputs, chemicals, fertilizers, and the more you use it, the more you must use it. I call it ecological narcotics. The more pesticides you spray, the more pests you have, so you must spray more pesticides. More synthetic fertilizer you apply, the more soil organisms you kill, and you must keep applying more and more synthetic fertilizer and urea. This means the farmers are in deep debt. And this debt aggravated further when the Monsantos of the world wanted to own the seed. And the reason I started Navdanya in 1987 is I said, no, seed is not an invention of Monsanto. Seed is not a manufacture. Seed is not intellectual property of the poison cartel. We'd save seeds. We'll create community seed banks. We will create ecological farms. We've trained 1 million farmers in India. And we have courses to work with the soil, with the biodiversity. Now, as every step of intensification increases, farmers' debt increases. And this has resulted in India in 400,000 farmers' suicide, combination of industrial farming and globalized agriculture. And across the world, farmers' suicides are much higher levels than normal suicides. Our work in agroecology shows that you can actually address climate change, reverse biodiversity law. Just today, I was working with my team on the farm, and we said, the heat is so intense. We said, let's measure the soil temperature and soil moisture. Where there are trees, and agroecology always has trees. Agroforestry and agroecology they go together. Industrial monocultures are barren land of row crops. 30 degrees different between our farm, where we have trees, and the local chemical farms, which are using urea. 15-fold difference in the soil moisture. We are creating deserts through industrial agriculture, and through ecological regenerative agriculture, we are making the earth as she is. She is rich, she's biodiverse, she's generous, she's abundant, and there needs to be no scarcity, there needs to be no hunger. Our work in Navdanya is showing we could feed 2 times the world's population by conserving biodiversity. We could feed 2 times the world population with healthy, nutritious food, not the nutritionally empty food that comes from industrial production.
How important are seeds and seed saving and plant breeding to the objectives of agroecology?
Seed is central to life. Seed is central to agriculture. Seed was central to industrial agriculture because the manipulation of agriculture began by appropriating the seed in order to make it more chemical friendly. For example, our native seeds are produced for food for animals, so lots of straw, and food for human beings, the grain. And the Green Revolution, with the application of chemicals, realized that with the tall straw, the crops would lodge. So they reduced the plant and reduced it into dwarf varieties with hard stalk. And then they told the farmers, burn the stalk. But it also created a mismeasure, because what's measured is a commodity that leaves the farm, not the health of the soil. And our book tells you about how much healthier the soils are. When you care for the soil, when you give back to the soil in gratitude, it doesn't measure what economy for the farmer, because it's a negative economy, it's a suicidal economy for the farmer. And it doesn't measure the quality of the food. Our native seeds, the rices, this is new research that's showing that 11% more protein than the so-called high-yielding varieties, more zinc, more magnesium, more potassium, more calcium, more iron. And the same with native wheat, 11% more protein. So what we have with industrial breeding, with the trick of the high-yielding variety, is make everyone blind to the biodiversity of the farm, to the health of the soil, the economy of the farmer, and the quality of the food you're eating. So seed is vital, not just because seed becomes food, but seed becomes even more vital when the same people who sell poisons now want genetic engineering and patenting. They've only got two crops, Roundup-resistant crops and Bt toxin crops, and both have failed. One was supposed to control weeds, it has created super weeds. The other was supposed to control pests, and it has created super pests in India. The indigenous seeds are not just resilient to pests, they're resilient to drought. In the seed banks that Navdanya has created, we've created 150 community seed banks. And in the seed banks were seeds that tolerated salt. And when the cyclone started to get intensive with climate change, these seeds of salt tolerance and flood tolerance have seen the farmers through and allowed farmers to bounce back after climate disasters. This year, the Green Revolution wheat varieties have collapsed because of the heat. There has been no impact on native wheat varieties. So whether you look at nourishment, nutrition, taste, or you look at resilience, both to climate, as well as markets, as well as pests and disease, and you look at the economy of the farmer, because native seeds are renewable. They're designed to become seed. Seed becomes seed. You don't have to buy it. Industrial seed is designed to be bought every year, whether it be hybrids or GMOs. Every year, high-cost seed bought is a debt recipe for farmer. So freedom for farmers and freedom for biodiversity means native seeds have to be safe. Open pollinated seeds have to be safe. Farms have to become biodiverse again with a true authentic measure, not of yield per acre, but nutrition per acre. And the minute we shift from the greed indicator of extraction, which is yield per acre, to the care indicator of health of the soil, the health of the plants, the health of the farmer, that's when we realize we can create abundance through indigenous seeds and biodiversity.
The world is facing a depletion of agricultural lands. How does agroecology rebuild soil, and how effective is it?
Because I've worked on these issues for 38 years, where we were always told that industrial agriculture is more efficient and it will use less land. But they never told you that these large-scale monocultures will use lots of land. Otherwise, why does the GMO soya industry of the United States have to invade into the lungs of the planet to the Amazon? It is land expansive because it grows in monocultures. And the expansion of land use is related to industrial agriculture. In ecological agriculture doesn't just use the same piece of land, it regenerates it. So the soils of the Navdanya farm are much richer over 20 years. We have more carbon, we have more nitrogen. Public health friends who saw zinc, we have 30% more zinc. And it's depleted. It's negative 14% in the chemical farms. So the chemical farming is a system to deplete the health of the soil and therefore deplete the nutrition of the food. Agroecology regenerates the soil because it gives back. Agroecology and regenerative farming also heal the carbon cycle, because climate change is a broken carbon cycle. We never needed fossil fuels in agriculture, and we will have to give it up, because not only is it a non-renewable resource, it is desertifying the land, it is pushing species to extinction, and there's no more land to grab. For this, we need to heal the soil through biodiversity. Biodiversity has the power to fix the carbon, to fix the nitrogen. We have nitrogen fixing crops, the pulses. All of them give back carbon to the earth, living carbon. But that's not all. Part of what industrial agriculture did is this fossilized our mind. It created the monoculture of the mind. It made us blind to the ecological functions of the living planet, the living earth. Taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and with the sunshine, food is created, carbohydrates are created, the living molecule is created, and also the oxygen we breathe. So what we do in ecological agriculture of the kind we practice at Navdanya, and your listeners are very welcome to come to attend our courses at Earth University. We offer one in October, the Return to Earth. Basically, by maximizing photosynthesis and maximizing biodiversity intensity, we shrink the acreage and enhance the biological productivity and get rid of external inputs. And I can say with deep confidence that's all documented. My 38 years of work is in the new book. And I have dedicated my life to deep interconnected research, to deep work with practicing farmers. It's not just theory. It's not just one farm, a million farmers. And all of them are debt-free. Their soils are resilient. None of them have had to leave agriculture. They are on their land. And during COVID, they would ring me up and say, we were not impacted by the pandemic.
There's a whole section of the book that concerns agroecology's potential as a climate solution and discusses a study conducted by Navdanya in 4 ecological regions of India to assess the impact of organic farming on climate adaptation. Can you tell us what the study found?
Well, our study found that there are 3 ways in which biodiverse organic agriculture, agroecology, give it whatever name, the principles of ecology, the way it is an answer to climate change is, first, it's not contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. It's not using the fossil fuels. It's not using the nitrogen fertilizers which give nitrous oxide. And it is not imprisoning animals who then become sources of methane. The CAFOs of America stink. Our free-range cows do not stink. So when people ask me, how do you know there's no methane? I said, stand near a CAFO and walk with a cow who's free range. That observation of the stink of methane that comes from waste dumps, that comes from CAFOs, all of that mitigation takes place when we shift to agroecology. So we stop the problem. But more than that, we pull out the excess carbon dioxide through the intensification of photosynthesis and biodiversity. And even more importantly, as more organic matter is put into the soil becomes climate resilient. In ecology, we know more diversity there is, the more resilient the system is. We grow nine, Navdanya means 9 crops. You grow 9 crops together, you can have a heavy rain or you can have a drought, you'll still have a crop. 12 crops we grow together. And our data is showing that the more diverse the system, not only is it more resilient in spite of climate chaos and climate havoc, it is more profitable for the farmers to grow biodiversity. But that biodiversity of the plants also enhances the biodiversity in soil, and that law of return of giving back organic matter to the soil makes the soil resilient. That's where the data we just collected today on soil moisture. If there's no moisture in the soil and you have a rainfall failure, you'll have no crop at all. But if your soil is organic and holds moisture for 1% organic matter, you can hold 160,000 liters per hectare of land. That's the difference between a crop failure and climate failure and survival. So no matter which way you look at it, biodiverse ecological agriculture is the answer to climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And the collective research of our community, the regeneration movement, shows that in 10 years, we could solve the climate problem if all the land became ecological, the forests, the pastures, the farmland, and the eaters would have healthy food. We would be able to get rid of the health pandemic.
Another main point you make in the book is the importance of biodiversity to agroecology for things like pest control. Can you tell us what that looks like and what organisms are involved?
So first, most people think of biodiversity as an external issue, but biodiversity is the web of life. That's what biodiversity is: bio, life, and the diversity of life. And the biodiversity of life weaves that web, whether it be in the soil, or it be the plants, or it be the insects. Now, why do we have pest damage? In a biodiverse field, you'll never, ever have a pest damage because the insects work together in wonderful, amazing relationships or pest-predator relationships. They're friendly insects. On our farm, we've counted 120 beneficial insects. They only exist for the simple reason we don't spray pesticides and insecticides. But our seeds, our native seeds, are also more resilient to pests. The GMOs are more vulnerable to pests, even when they're designed to be pest resistant, like the Bt toxin. The year Bhopal happened, 1984, I started a campaign, No More Bhopals, let's plant neem. We have hundreds of plants that control pests through plant botanicals: the neem, the pongamia, the curry leaf. And the book has all the multiple ways we can regulate pests, enhance the insect population, enhance the pollinator population. Our research has shown that 1/3 of the food we eat is provided by pollinators. And on our farm, because we save biodiversity of plants, we have biodiversity of insects, we have biodiversity of pollinators. There are 6 times more pollinators on the farm than in the forest next door, which also shows that farming does not necessarily in of itself has to be destructive, which is a myth in many people's minds in the West, because they only know industrial agriculture. They only know CAFOs. So they extrapolate their violent experience and think that's the way the whole world lives. No, most of the world makes peace with the earth. We are biodiverse cultures who have conserved biodiversity on 25% of the land where indigenous people are. Today, 80% of the biodiversity exists. So for me, farming is about working with biodiversity, co-creating with biodiversity to solve the problems of insects and pests being out of balance, of weeds, solve the problem of water conservation, solve the problem of carbon recycling and nitrogen fixing. Biodiversity is the answer, and all ecological systems need diversity. Therefore, agroecology is biodiversity based.
You've already touched on the nutritional and health benefits of agroecology, but could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So I realized with my eyes that monoculture fields of just rice or just wheat or just soy or just corn could not possibly be producing more nutrition than biodiverse fields. My eyes could tell me that. So I started to measure biodiversity and biodiverse productivity. Then we converted that into nutrition. And we measured nutrition per acre rather than yield per acre. And the more intense your biodiversity is, the more cooperation between different plants there is, the more they help each other, and the more they help the soil organisms. And the soil organisms provide the nutrition in plants. The nutrition in plants does not come from nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It comes from soil organisms. And the richer your soil with fungi, with bacteria, beneficial bacteria, the more nutrients and chemicals it's creating, which it contributes to the plant. So organic plants have far more nutrients and far more taste and quality than chemical food, which is nutritionally empty, pure mass. It is Cartesian victory in food, but food is about nutrition and taste. So it's nutritionally empty and tasteless. Taste is, in fact, a way in which complexity of nutrients in organic food speak to our body. Taste is the conversation between living food and our living body. And tastelessness is the tastelessness of the attack of chemicals on the soil or on our food. So what we have is a giant machine to produce lots of commodities and mass that gets sold for biofuel one day, animal feed the next day, Kellogg's cornflakes another day, but it is not food. Ecological agriculture produces food and all the qualities of food, that it nourishes you, it makes you healthy. That intensification comes from ecological agriculture. And our report, Health Per Acre, shows by intensifying biodiversity and measuring nutrition per acre rather than yield per acre, we are actually making twice the food available that India needs. We don't need to have hunger. We don't need to have malnutrition. I'll give you a simple example. A biodiverse feed with 8 or 9 crops will give you 900 kilograms in a mountain area. One of those crops will be corn. It will give you 4 units of corn. With Green Revolution, high-yielding hybrid corn, you'll take the corn from 4 to 5, but all the other crops have disappeared. So you have lost. You've taken corn from 1 to 5, but you have made all the other crops disappear, which gave you the zinc, the iron, the calcium, and all the other nutrients you need. So we have created a commodity system and a system of merely measuring energy in food, not all the diverse nutrients, the polyphenols that are only there when the soil organisms have fed your food and that food is feeding us. So the links between the soil, the plants, and our health, it's the medical community that's waking up to it. And I think the ecological agriculture community needs to work hand in hand with the health community to show that health, nutrition, availability of good food is a continuum from the soil to the plants to us. Feed the soil, it will feed you.
And what's the social justice argument for wider adoption of agroecology?
Industrial agriculture's first attack is on farmers themselves. And that's the first injustice. And look at America, a land of small farmers is now a land of agribusiness. But that's not all. The same industrial agriculture and agribusiness then destroys the lands and farms of other countries. Look at what happened with NAFTA and Mexico. So uprooted farmers of Mexico then come as landless workers to America. That's the second level of injustice. So when we start to use land more caringly, more lovingly, intensify biodiversity, small farms start to produce more small farmers can take care of the land and have livelihoods, and the landless people don't have to become workers on giant agribusiness farms. Decentralization of farming is vital to care for the land. And for me, it is shocking that Mr. Gates, about whom I've done 2 books, one is called Philanthrocapitalism and one is called Oneness versus 1%, he has emerged as the largest farmland owner of America. Of course, there's a very big social justice issue. Industrial agriculture, globalized trade, fake food, fake chemical inputs to farming is a recipe of exploitation of the earth and exploitation of the workers of the earth. Agroecology is co-creation of respect by the workers of the earth and respect for the workers of the earth. And our work has shown that only 5% of what the consumer pays reaches the farmer in a globalized, industrialized system. Whereas in the ecological, agroecological system, fair trade systems that we build, 50 to 60% goes straight to the farmer and the rest goes to their organizations to organize community economies, to organize the processing, to organize everything else that it takes. Yes, we can create justice at the same time through which we create ecological systems.
There's a question posed in the foreword to the book that I wanted to get you to answer for us today. It says, with all the knowledge and science available to make the transformation of the food system a reality, what levers could be best applied? How would you answer that question? What can we do to spur the transition to agroecological systems?
Small farmers who work with us have already given up their addiction to the ecological narcotics that industrial chemicals in farming are. I just heard an amazing set of speeches at the convocation ceremony of an agricultural school in France, where these young people are saying, we are being trained to be slaves for the agrochemical industry, and we will not be. We will go to the land, live with less, work in service of the earth. And And they were getting claps at the convocation. So, if you're fighting racism, the apartheid in South Africa, the injustice of the British Empire in India, what did the people use as an instrument? No, do not cooperate. So we have to say no to the destructive system. That's why I started a campaign, poison-free food and farming. And poison-free food and farming is not just choice of the farmer to stop using poisons and practice agroecology. It's a choice of the eaters to say, I will not poison myself. I will not get cancer. I will not get diabetes. I will not get all kinds of new diseases that are coming up as our metabolism is destroyed. So the choice to say no to destruction, to poisons, to injustice, to the devastation of the land is a choice each of us can make. And that choice is being made in more and more places. But along with that has to be a vigilance. This is democracy to say, no, this law of deregulation of GMOs will destroy more monarch butterflies, destroy more farmers, destroy more biodiversity. Deregulation, which is the other name for globalization, has to be resisted at any cost. Patents on seed, because seeds are not invented, has to be resisted at any cost. So the two things that need to be done simultaneously are regenerating the land and saying no to the destruction. And there's constantly the argument, oh, how will you scale up? The hierarchies created by industrialism assume that all scaling is vertical. In my lifetime of 50 years of service to the earth, what we talk about is scaling out horizontally. Across other species, we've got to go out of anthropocentrism and realize that we are part of an earth family. And then when we work with them, we produce much more, also for the human species. Working with others, destroying other species to feed ourselves more actually is doing the opposite. Feeding other species, feeding the soil, feeding the butterflies gives us more food. So what is needed is a paradigm shift, a mind shift. And I can tell you, because of the number of talks I do, there's a huge shift taking place. Tomorrow, I'm going to be addressing activists in remote forests of the Borneo. Day after, I'll be addressing a university, a Ghanaian university. That shift is huge. The paradigm shift is taking place. But, the echo chambers of the big money, the big cartel, they make us think that everything is going in their side. Otherwise, the Syngenta chief didn't have to say, oh, the Swiss must give up eating organic. Otherwise, Africa will starve. They think propaganda, which has worked for them for 100 years, will work for them at a time of collapse, where everyone is seeking a way to regenerate the earth. Everyone is looking for a way to prevent collapse.
So what do you hope is people's main takeaway from your book?
Well, because the book is really a synthesis of my 38 years of research, activism, organizing, I hope that no matter who reads the book, they'll go away saying, oh, this is what I can do. I'm a researcher. I can do more work on the soil richness. If I'm in health, I can do more work on these connections. If I'm in economics or in the justice movement, these indicators in our health and wealth per acre chapter will show them what they can do. Well, I think the largest number of activists today are climate activists. I hope the chapter on climate solutions will let people know that we have been blind to the fact that the destruction of biodiversity and replacement with fossil fuels is the beginning of the climate problem 200 years ago. So no matter who it is, seed savers, I hope they go away saying, this is so beautiful, the work of saving seeds. And we don't need poisons. The chapter on managing the diversity of insects without poisons that kill human beings and the insect diversity, they'll go away and say, we're going to make campuses. We're going to make communities that are poison-free. We are going to create healthy environments for our school, our towns. And I work with, the mayors have called me 2 or 3 times, and they're very alive to this, because part of what globalization has done is it has made us think that governance only happens at centralized levels. But governance is decentralized. And the most deepest democracy is what I call earth democracy, where we work with the earth as citizens of the earth. And that is where real change is happening. But local towns are shifting. Regions are shifting. Countries are shifting. Look at south of the border. Mexico has said no GMOs, no glyphosate. So there's so much people can do. And I just hope that the book will let everyone who reads it say, I don't have to go into despair. I don't have to go into trauma. Here is work I can do to heal the earth and say thank you to her.
If you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, and just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mongabay newscast nearly 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram, where our handle is @Mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.